The silence in the Spencer mansion has a weight to it, a thickness that presses against the walls and seeps into the very wood of the floorboards. It's the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing, your own footsteps echoing through corridors where footsteps should no longer fall. But beneath that silence, if you listen closely enough, there's something else. A sound so faint you might convince yourself it's imagined. The soft, ragged draw of breath where there should be none. The quiet stirring of something that should have stayed still. This is the sound of the Crimson Heads, and understanding what they are requires us to descend into one of the darkest chapters of the Resident Evil universe, to a moment when scientific ambition collided with biological horror in ways that even Umbrella Corporation's researchers could not have predicted. The story of the Crimson Heads begins not with their creation, but with their discovery. In May of 1998, deep within the Arklay Mountains, northwest of Raccoon City, the Spencer Mansion stood as it had for decades, a Gothic monument to architectural excess and hidden purpose. Designed by the renowned and tragic George Trevor in the 1960s, the mansion was never simply a residence. Beneath its labyrinthine halls and elaborate puzzle locks lay the Arklay Laboratory, one of Umbrella Corporation's most secretive research facilities, a place where the boundaries between life and death had been systematically dismantled in pursuit of the perfect biological weapon. The laboratory had been operational since 1967, quietly pursuing the development of what would become known as the tyrant virus, or T-virus. This engineered pathogen, derived from the progenitor virus discovered in West Africa, represented Umbrella's ambition to create a new generation of warfare, to transform the human body into something beyond mortality, beyond limitation. But the T-virus was temperamental, unpredictable in its effects. Early strains killed too quickly or produced zombies too deteriorated to serve any tactical purpose. The researchers needed something more controllable, more refined. By 1998, after decades of experimentation, the Arklay Laboratory had developed what they designated as the Epsilon strain. This particular variant of the T-virus had been engineered specifically for the Tyrant Project, an initiative to create super soldiers who could survive the virus's mutagenic effects while retaining combat capability and some measure of obedience. The Epsilon strain was meant to be the solution to one of the T-virus's most persistent problems. Excessive brain damage during the initial infection process reduced most subjects to shambling, mindless zombies rather than the intelligent bioweapons Umbrella envisioned. What the researchers at Arklay couldn't know, was that the Epsilon strain carried within it a secondary mutation pathway that would only reveal itself under specific conditions. This pathway was called VACT, short for virus activation, and it would transform the very nature of the undead threat in ways that would catch even seasoned Umbrella staff completely unprepared. On May 11, 1998, disaster struck the Arklay Laboratory. The specific circumstances of the outbreak have been attributed to the Queen Leech, a unique organism that had bonded with the DNA of the deceased researcher James Marcus, creating a vengeful intelligence bent on Umbrella's destruction. During a surgical procedure on the T-002 Tyrant, the Epsilon strain was accidentally released in its airborne form. The virus spread rapidly through the facility's ventilation systems, infecting staff members within hours. The containment protocols that should have protected the personnel failed. Security officers, under orders from Umbrella's crisis management team, sealed the laboratory to prevent the outbreak from reaching the outside world. Anyone attempting to escape was shot on sight. The mansion became a tomb, its corridors filling with the infected, with researchers who watched their colleagues transform before their eyes into the shambling dead they had studied for so long.
But the Epsilon strain was not like the earlier variants. As the infected staff members succumbed to the virus and were put down by those still uninfected, something unexpected began to occur. The bodies did not simply remain inert. The virus continued to work within them, entering what researchers would later term a dormant phase, a period of apparent death that masked intense cellular activity beneath the surface. The first documented case of what would become known as a crimson head occurred within days of the initial outbreak. An Umbrella researcher whose name has been lost to history, but whose designation remains in the records as Crimson Head Prototype 1, was exposed to the Epsilon strain during the chaos. Unlike most subjects who died quickly or transformed into standard zombies, this individual underwent a different process. When security personnel attempted to subdue him after his initial transformation into a zombie, they succeeded in incapacitating him. His body was moved to a holding area for study. This was the first critical mistake in understanding the Epsilon strain. The researchers believed that an incapacitated zombie was, for all intents and purposes, neutralized. They had observed countless subjects in similar states across years of experimentation. But the Epsilon strain was different. During the period of apparent death, the VACT process began. VACT represents a fundamental shift in how the T-virus operates within an infected host. Under normal circumstances, the initial infection causes rapid cellular breakdown. Brain function deteriorates, metabolism slows to a crawl, and the subject enters what appears to be a death state, only to reanimate as a zombie driven by base hunger instincts. But with the Epsilon strain, when a zombie is severely wounded or incapacitated, the virus doesn't simply maintain its initial effects, it reactivates. This reactivation triggers a cascade of cellular regeneration far more extensive than the initial infection. The virus begins reconstructing body tissue, repairing damaged cells, and most significantly, accelerating the host's metabolism. The heart, which had been beating at an almost imperceptible rate, begins to pump with renewed vigor. This increased cardiac activity causes blood to flow through the decaying tissue at an accelerated rate. And because the flesh is already compromised, already torn and deteriorated, this blood seeps through the wounds and pores, staining the creature's skin a deep, unmistakable crimson. This is where the name comes from, not from any laboratory designation, but from the visceral reality of what the virus creates. A zombie whose very appearance speaks to the violent regeneration occurring within, whose red-stained flesh marks it as something fundamentally different from the pale, shambling dead. But the color is only the most visible change. The VACT process triggers far more profound transformations. The skeletal system begins to mutate, with bone growth accelerating at the fingertips, extending and sharpening into claws capable of rending flesh. These claws, unlike the blunt, grasping hands of standard zombies, are weapons of surprising effectiveness, able to tear through clothing and skin with ease. The muscular system undergoes similar reconstruction. While the muscle tissue is still decayed, still deteriorating, the increased metabolic rate provides a surge of energy that allows for movement patterns impossible for a normal zombie. Perhaps most unsettling is the restoration of respiratory function. Standard zombies, while technically animated corpses, show minimal breathing patterns, but Crimson Heads breathe. You can hear it, that ragged, labored inhale and exhale that makes them sound almost alive, almost human. This respiratory activity serves no obvious biological function, since the virus has long since replaced the need for oxygen in the conventional sense. But it persists nonetheless, a haunting reminder that the line between life and death has been thoroughly obliterated.
The first Umbrella staff members to encounter Prototype 1 after its V-Act transformation were completely unprepared. They had come to feed the specimen, a routine procedure conducted countless times with captured zombies. But when they opened the holding cell, they did not find a slow, predictable subject. They found something that moved with shocking speed, something that leapt at them with predatory intent. 4 researchers died in that encounter before security could intervene. The violence was extreme, the speed overwhelming. Prototype 1 demonstrated capabilities far beyond any zombie previously observed. The ability to run, to pursue targets with sustained aggression, to coordinate attacks with what appeared to be slightly elevated intelligence compared to standard infected. The head of the laboratory, Dr. John Clemens, immediately ordered Prototype 1 to be isolated and placed in maximum containment. The decision was made to store Prototype 1 in a highly unusual location, a coffin in the cemetery beneath the mansion. This wasn't simply a storage decision, but a defensive one. The Spencer Mansion had been designed by George Trevor with elaborate security measures, many of which involved turning the mansion's architecture itself into a weapon against intruders. By placing Prototype 1 in a sealed coffin that could only be opened by solving a complex puzzle involving 4 death masks, Clemens effectively transformed the creature into a living trap. Anyone attempting to breach the underground crypt would have to face what was arguably the most dangerous specimen in the facility. But Prototype 1 was not the end of the Crimson Head phenomenon. It was only the beginning. As the outbreak continued to spread through the facility, more and more infected staff members were put down by those still fighting for survival. And as these bodies lay in the corridors and rooms of the mansion, the V-Act process began to occur in multiple subjects. The survivors in the facility quickly recognized a pattern. Bodies that appeared dead would,
After a period of time that seemed to vary between 20 minutes and several hours, begin to show the signs of the transformation. The skin would take on that characteristic reddish tint. The fingernails would elongate into claws. And then, with horrifying suddenness, the creature would rise, faster and more dangerous than before.
The umbrella staff, many of whom were scientists rather than security personnel, had to adapt quickly to this new threat. They established an informal protocol: destroy the bodies. Complete destruction of the head or burning the corpse prevented the V-Act process from occurring. But implementing this policy in a facility under siege, with limited resources and dwindling numbers, proved almost impossible. The mansion's corridors began to fill not just with the slow-moving dead, but with these faster, more aggressive variants. The psychological impact on the survivors cannot be overstated. Imagine being trapped in an isolated mansion with limited ammunition, watching your colleagues transform into zombies, putting them down with what little weaponry you can find, only to discover that death is no longer a permanent state for these creatures, that the hallway you cleared an hour ago might now contain something far more dangerous than when you left it, that every corner you turn, every room you enter, carries the possibility of encountering one of these crimson-skinned nightmares. Many researchers, according to documents recovered after the incident, chose suicide rather than face transformation or being torn apart by their former colleagues. Some locked themselves in rooms and waited to die. Others attempted desperate escape attempts, only to be shot by security or overwhelmed by the infected. The mansion became a house of horrors in the truest sense, a place where death had lost its finality. The scientific understanding of what was occurring remained incomplete even as the outbreak spiraled out of control. Researchers who survived long enough to document their observations noted that the V-Act transformation seemed to be triggered by the host entering a dormant state, either through severe injury or prolonged lack of sustenance. The virus, they theorized, was attempting to preserve the host's survival through aggressive mutation, treating the incapacitated zombie's body as a resource to be optimized for predation. This theory aligned with what they knew about the T-virus's broader behavior. The virus was, in essence, rewriting the rules of cellular function, prioritizing propagation and host preservation over conventional biology. When a zombie was damaged to the point where it could no longer hunt effectively, the virus responded by reconstructing the host into a more effective predator. It was evolution compressed into a time frame of minutes or hours rather than millennia, guided not by natural selection, but by the virus's engineered imperative to survive and spread. What made the Crimson Heads particularly terrifying from a military perspective was their potential as a secondary threat. Standard zombies, while dangerous in numbers, could be managed with appropriate training and firepower. They were slow, predictable, easily avoided or dispatched. But Crimson Heads represented a force multiplier. Any zombie that was wounded but not completely destroyed would eventually transform into a faster, stronger variant. This meant that a military force clearing an infected area couldn't simply move through and neutralize threats.
They had to ensure complete destruction of every zombie encountered, or risk facing an even more dangerous enemy when they inevitably had to backtrack through the same territory. The Spencer Mansion's architecture exacerbated this problem. The building was designed as a maze, with interconnected rooms, multiple pathways between locations, and numerous corridors that survivors would need to traverse repeatedly. There was no straight path through the facility. You couldn't clear an area once and consider it safe. The very structure of the building meant constant backtracking, constant re-exposure to areas you'd already passed through. And in those areas, in those hallways you thought you'd cleared, the Crimson Heads waited.
The transformation time varied, and this variability added another layer of unpredictability to the threat. Some zombies would undergo V-Act within 20 minutes of being incapacitated. Others might remain dormant for an hour or more. This meant there was no safe timeline, no way to know with certainty when a body might resurrect. A hallway cleared 30 minutes ago might be safe, or it might now contain a Crimson Head. The only way to know was to return and see, a prospect that filled even the most hardened security personnel with dread. The survivors who remained in the facility by late May had learned, through terrible experience, a few methods to prevent the V-Act transformation. The most reliable was to destroy the zombie's head completely during the initial encounter. A well-placed shotgun blast to the skull would not only kill the zombie, but also prevent any possibility of resurrection. Similarly, destroying the creature's legs to the point where locomotion became impossible would render it incapable of hunting, though this method was less certain, as the V-Act process involved regeneration. The other method was burning. Fire proved highly effective at preventing transformation, as it destroyed the body tissue to a degree that the virus could not regenerate. But fire required resources, a source of ignition, and, in the case of the mansion's layout, flammable accelerants like kerosene. The facility had a limited supply of these materials stored in various locations throughout the complex. Each use had to be carefully considered. Do you burn this body, knowing that you'll need to return through this corridor multiple times? Or do you conserve the kerosene for a more critical location and simply avoid this area in the future? These decisions, made under extreme stress with imperfect information, defined the survival strategies of those trapped in the mansion. Some chose to burn almost every zombie they killed, prioritizing safety over resource conservation. Others took the opposite approach, killing only when absolutely necessary and relying on speed and evasion to navigate around threats. Both strategies had their merits and their costs. The Crimson Heads themselves displayed behavioral patterns that differed from standard zombies in subtle but significant ways. While normal zombies would pursue prey within their immediate vicinity, Crimson Heads showed what researchers termed enhanced prey recognition. Once a Crimson Head detected a living human, it would pursue with single-minded determination, only abandoning the chase when the target left the immediate area. This persistence made them far more dangerous in confined spaces where evasion became difficult or impossible.
Some crimson heads exhibited what appeared to be rudimentary tactical behavior. Rather than immediately attacking when a human entered a room, certain specimens would remain prone, playing dead, until the target came closer. This ambush behavior suggested a slight increase in cognitive function compared to standard zombies, though whether this represented genuine intelligence or simply more complex instinctive behavior remains a subject of debate among researchers who later studied the outbreak. The physical capabilities of crimson heads were genuinely impressive from a purely biological standpoint. The creatures could move at speeds approaching that of a running human, despite their deteriorated muscle tissue. They could leap short distances with surprising force. Their grip strength, combined with those bone claws, made their attacks devastating. A single strike from a crimson head could cause severe lacerations, and if the creature managed to grab hold of a victim, escape became nearly impossible without assistance. The increased aggression displayed by crimson heads appeared to correlate with the heightened metabolism. The virus was burning through the host's remaining energy reserves at an accelerated rate, creating a state of extreme hunger that drove the creature to pursue prey more vigorously than a standard zombie. This also meant that crimson heads, while more dangerous, had a shorter operational lifespan than normal zombies. They burned out faster, their bodies consuming themselves in the pursuit of sustenance. But if the crimson head transformation could occur, researchers began to wonder, was this the final form? Or simply another stage in a longer mutation process? This question became particularly relevant when samples of the Epsilon strain were extracted from Prototype 1 and taken to other umbrella facilities for analysis. Dr. William Birkin, working in the Nest laboratory hidden beneath Raccoon City, received samples of the VACT strain for further study. Birkin's research led to a modified version of the Epsilon strain, one that would produce even more dramatic mutations in incapacitated zombies. Rather than creating crimson heads, this new variant, designated T. Birkin, would transform zombies into creatures called lickers. These mutations represented a further evolution of the VACT process, where the cellular reconstruction went far beyond what was seen in crimson heads. Lickers, observed extensively during the Raccoon City outbreak months later, displayed characteristics that suggested they were what crimson heads would become given sufficient time and further exposure to the virus. The skin would completely deteriorate, exposing raw muscle tissue. The brain would expand beyond the confines of the skull, become invisible.
The tongue would elongate into a whip-like appendage capable of impaling prey. The hands would develop even larger claws, and the entire body would become adapted for climbing, allowing the creatures to navigate on walls and ceilings. This evolutionary pathway revealed something profound about the nature of the T-virus mutations. The zombie form was not a stable end state, but rather the first stage in a potential chain of transformations. Given the right conditions and sufficient time, a standard zombie could become a crimson head, which could then undergo further mutation into a licker. Each stage represented an optimization of the body for predation, a refinement of the horror the virus could create.
However, in the Spencer mansion during the May outbreak, the transformation rarely progressed beyond the Crimson Head stage. The time frame was too short, the conditions too chaotic. Most Crimson Heads that formed were destroyed by survivors before they could undergo further mutation, and those that weren't destroyed found themselves in an environment with dwindling prey and limited resources to sustain the extreme metabolic demands of further transformation. Prototype 1, locked in its coffin beneath the cemetery, represented a unique case. Having been contained early in the outbreak and kept in a state of enforced dormancy, it never progressed to the licker stage, despite being the original Crimson Head specimen. Some researchers theorized that the cold, sealed environment of the coffin essentially put the creature into a form of viral stasis, preventing further mutation. Others suggest that individual genetic factors in the original host prevented the progression to the next stage. The truth remains uncertain. What is certain is that when STARS operatives entered the Spencer mansion on July 24, 1998, investigating the bizarre murders that had been occurring in the Arklay Mountains, they walked into a nightmare shaped by these mutations. The mansion by then had been contaminated for over 2 months. The initial outbreak had killed or infected virtually all personnel. The facility was now a tomb populated by the undead, including numerous Crimson Heads that had formed from zombies killed during the desperate early days of the outbreak. The STARS teams, Alpha and Bravo, were elite police operatives, but they were not prepared for what they encountered. Their training focused on human threats, terrorists, armed criminals, hostage situations. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for reanimated corpses, much less for corpses that could resurrect into faster, deadlier forms. The reports filed by survivors of the mansion incident speak to the terror of encountering Crimson Heads for the first time. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, the primary protagonists who survived and escaped the mansion, described the disorienting horror of returning through a cleared hallway only to be ambushed by creatures they'd thought were neutralized. The mansion's architecture became a trap, with every corridor potentially harboring these threats. The limited resources available to the STARS members made the Crimson Head threat even more acute. They had entered the mansion expecting a standard investigation, not a prolonged survival scenario. Their ammunition was limited. The kerosene tanks scattered throughout the facility could prevent transformations, but there weren't enough of them to burn every zombie. They had to make constant tactical decisions about which threats to neutralize completely and which to simply evade. These decisions had consequences that played out over hours and days. A zombie left unburned in a corridor you needed to traverse repeatedly would eventually transform, creating a choke point that forced longer, more dangerous alternate routes. Areas of the mansion that could have served as safe passage became impassable as Crimson Heads accumulated. The mansion itself seemed to constrict around the survivors, the safe areas shrinking as the dangers multiplied.
The psychological warfare inherent in the Crimson Head mechanic cannot be overstated. It wasn't just about the physical danger of the creatures themselves, though that was certainly significant. It was about the way they undermined the sense of progress, the way they transformed victory into merely delayed defeat. You kill a zombie, you feel a moment of relief, and you move forward. But that relief is temporary, because you know, or quickly learn, that unless you've taken specific steps to prevent it, that zombie will return, stronger and faster than before. This created a constant state of anxiety. Every zombie encountered required not just the ammunition to kill it, but the decision about whether to expend additional resources to ensure it stayed dead. And if you chose not to burn it, if you decided to conserve those precious resources, then you had to remember where that body was, had to mentally map which areas of the mansion might now harbor Crimson Heads. The mansion became a mental burden as much as a physical one. A maze you had to constantly update in your mind with information about threats both present and potential. The sound design associated with Crimson Heads added another dimension to their horror. While standard zombies produced the low moans and shuffling footsteps that had become iconic to the franchise, Crimson Heads breathed. You could hear them before you saw them, that ragged, labored respiration echoing through the mansion's halls. And when they ran, the sound of their footfalls was distinctly different from a zombie's shuffle, sharper, faster, more purposeful. These audio cues served as warnings, but warnings that often came too late when you were already in close quarters with the creature. The visual design of the Crimson Heads reinforced their role as an escalated threat. The red-stained skin wasn't just decorative. It communicated immediately that this was not a standard zombie. The claws were visible even from a distance. The way they moved, that unnatural sprint that seemed to defy the decay of their bodies, created an uncanny valley effect that struck at something primal in the human psyche. They looked human enough to be recognizable as former people, but they moved in ways that no living human could, creating a dissonance that many survivors found more disturbing than the clearly inhuman bioorganic weapons also present in the facility. The Spencer Mansion's specific environment played a crucial role in how the Crimson Head threat manifested. The building was designed to be isolated, surrounded by the vast wilderness of the Arklay Mountains. There was no easy escape, no way to simply flee and call for conventional backup. The nearest town, Raccoon City, was miles through treacherous mountain terrain. Helicopter evacuation was the only practical exit, and the facility's helipad was located in a way that required traversing large portions of the mansion to reach. This meant that survival required clearing and reclaiming sections of the building, establishing safe routes between critical locations. The library, the dining room, the various laboratories, the underground passages, all of these became territories that needed to be secured and maintained. But securing them against Crimson Heads required either complete elimination of all zombies in an area, or acceptance that those spaces would eventually become contested again.
The mansion's multiple save rooms, small chambers where survivors could rest and reorganize, became islands of safety in this environment. These rooms, for reasons never fully explained in the available documentation, were never entered by the infected. Whether this was due to some peculiarity in the virus's effect on infected behavior, or simply a quirk of the mansion's design that made these particular rooms difficult for the creatures to access, the save rooms provided crucial respites from the constant threat. But reaching these save rooms required navigating through areas that grew progressively more dangerous as the Crimson Head population increased. The routes between safety became gauntlets, corridors where you had to move quickly and carefully, always aware that the zombie you passed 10 minutes ago might now be the Crimson Head pursuing you. The specific layout of certain areas seemed almost designed to maximize the Crimson Head threat. Long corridors with sharp turns where you couldn't see what was ahead.
rooms with multiple entrances that allowed crimson heads to pursue from unexpected angles, staircases where the fixed camera angles made it difficult to judge the distance between you and an approaching threat. These environmental factors transformed every movement through the mansion into a tense calculation of risk and reward. One of the most infamous encounters in the mansion involved a pre-positioned crimson head that would always activate when survivors attempted to obtain a critical key. This creature, strategically placed by Umbrella's security protocols as part of the mansion's defensive systems, served as a wake-up call for any STARS members who hadn't yet understood the full nature of the threat. It couldn't be avoided. Obtaining the key required passing directly through its location, and it would rise with sudden violence, often catching survivors unprepared and forcing them to either expend significant resources fighting it or accept damage in order to escape. This forced encounter was representative of Umbrella's defensive philosophy: transform the facility itself into a weapon. Use the bioorganic weapons not just as guards, but as elements of the environment that intruders would inevitably have to confront. The Crimson Heads, particularly Prototype 1 in its coffin, were tools in this larger system of defense. Prototype 1's eventual encounter with STARS members, assuming they solved the death mask puzzle and opened the suspended coffin, represented perhaps the most dangerous single enemy confrontation in the mansion. Having been contained since early in the outbreak and kept in a state of enforced dormancy, Prototype 1 had remained dormant for months, the virus's effects partially suspended but never eliminated. When the coffin opened, the creature that emerged was not just a Crimson Head, but the original, the prototype, that had killed 4 trained Umbrella security personnel. The battle that ensued in the confined space of the underground crypt tested the limits of the STARS members' combat ability and resource management. Prototype 1 was faster than other Crimson Heads, more aggressive, more resilient. Standard weaponry had limited effect. Only the most powerful arms available to the STARS teams, magnum revolvers, grenade launchers, combat shotguns at close range, could reliably bring it down. And in that confined space, with stone walls preventing retreat and the creature's speed making distance difficult to maintain, the encounter was often a desperate struggle for survival. The significance of defeating Prototype 1 extended beyond simply eliminating a single threat. It granted access to portions of the facility that were otherwise inaccessible, advancing the investigation and the path toward eventual escape. Umbrella had, in essence, weaponized the most dangerous specimen they had created, turning it into a living lock on the mansion's secrets. Throughout all of this, the philosophical implications of the Crimson Head phenomenon remained largely unexplored by those experiencing it firsthand. The STARS survivors were focused on immediate survival, not on contemplating what these creatures represented. But from a broader perspective, Crimson Heads embody one of the most disturbing aspects of the Resident Evil universe: the complete dismantling of death as a concept. In nature, death is final. It's the endpoint of biological existence, the moment when the systems that sustain life cease to function. But the T-virus, and particularly the Epsilon strain's V-ACT process, transforms death into merely a transitional state. The body doesn't end, it transforms. And that transformation can occur multiple times, each stage representing a new form of unlife, a new configuration of flesh and bone designed for predation. This violates something fundamental in how humans understand the world. We rely on death having permanence, on the idea that once a threat is neutralized, it stays neutralized. The Crimson Heads break this contract, revealing a universe where elimination is only temporary, where today's victory might be tomorrow's greater threat. It's a form of existential horror that goes beyond simple fear of monsters or death.
It's the horror of a world where the rules have changed at such a fundamental level that safety itself becomes an illusion. The survivors of the mansion incident who escaped on July 25, 1998, emerged with knowledge that would haunt them. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, along with Rebecca Chambers, Barry Burton, and Brad Vikers, had witnessed firsthand what Umbrella Corporation's research had created. They had fought through hordes of undead, had watched zombies resurrect as Crimson Heads, had barely survived encounters with creatures that should not exist. Their testimonies, initially dismissed by Raccoon City officials corrupted by Umbrella's influence, would eventually prove crucial in understanding the broader outbreak that would consume the entire city months later. But in those testimonies, the Crimson Heads occupied a special place of horror, remembered by survivors as among the most disturbing enemies they had encountered, not because they were the most powerful, but because of what they represented. The Crimson Heads proved that Umbrella's research had achieved something truly terrible, the ability to make death itself unreliable. In a world where the dead can rise, where that rising can happen multiple times with increasing danger, nowhere is truly safe. Every victory is provisional, every cleared area potentially compromised. The mansion became a metaphor for this new reality, a physical space where the normal rules of existence had been suspended and replaced with something nightmarish. After the mansion's destruction, when Rebecca Chambers activated the facility's self-destruct system and the survivors escaped via helicopter mere minutes before the explosion, the Crimson Heads were seemingly eliminated. The intense heat and subsequent structural collapse should have destroyed any remaining specimens, Prototype 1 included. The Epsilon strain samples that had been in the facility were either destroyed or had already been transferred to other locations for further study.
But the knowledge of what the strain could do, the understanding of the VACT process, survived. William Birkin's modifications to create the liquor-producing variant proved that the underlying principles could be refined and enhanced. The data recovered from the mansion incident, despite Umbrella's attempts to destroy all evidence, provided valuable information about mutation pathways and secondary transformation triggers. In the years following the mansion incident, the Crimson Head phenomenon remained largely confined to documentation and the memories of those who had experienced it. The Epsilon strain's tendency to produce VACT transformations was considered a unique property, one that subsequent T-virus variants deliberately avoided in favor of more controllable mutation patterns. The unpredictability of the transformation timing, the difficulty in controlling the resulting specimens, made Crimson Heads impractical as intentional bioorganic weapons, despite their enhanced capabilities. This decision to move away from VACT-capable strains reveals an interesting aspect of Umbrella's priorities. While they were willing to create monsters, they wanted monsters they could control, direct, and deploy with some measure of predictability. Crimson Heads, with their spontaneous resurrection and enhanced aggression, were too wild, too difficult to manage. They represented the virus doing its own thing, following its own evolutionary logic rather than the designer's intentions. Yet the concept persisted in certain black market circles and among organizations that acquired Umbrella's research data after the corporation's eventual collapse. The idea of a self-regenerating threat, zombies that could resurrect into more dangerous forms, had obvious appeal to anyone interested in creating sustained chaos or testing defense systems under extreme conditions.
Reports of VACT-capable strains appearing in isolated outbreaks continued to surface occasionally in the years after Raccoon City's destruction, though verification remained difficult. The psychological legacy of the Crimson Heads extended beyond their direct victims. For those who survived the mansion incident, the creatures became a sort of nightmare made manifest, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in that place. Chris Redfield, in particular, spoke little about the experience publicly, but those close to him noted his reluctance to discuss the Crimson Heads specifically, as though even recounting them brought back a particular flavor of terror that other creatures from the incident did not. Jill Valentine, who had access to more versatile weaponry during her time in the mansion, including the grenade launcher with incendiary rounds, had slightly better experiences managing the threat, but still described the Crimson Heads as among the most stressful enemies to face. The constant resource management decisions they forced, the mental burden of tracking which zombies had been properly neutralized and which might resurrect, wore on her psychologically in ways that straightforward combat encounters did not. The architectural knowledge required to efficiently navigate the mansion while managing the Crimson Head threat spoke to something the creatures revealed about survival in contaminated environments. It wasn't enough to simply be a good shot or to be brave. You needed to think spatially, strategically, to understand the environment as a dynamic system where threats could appear in previously cleared areas. You needed to prioritize routes, manage resources across vast timescales, and make decisions whose consequences might not manifest for hours. This tactical complexity, this elevation of survival horror from simple combat to a form of strategic planning under pressure, represented perhaps the most significant legacy of the Crimson Heads. They demonstrated that truly effective bioorganic weapons didn't need to be the biggest or the strongest. They simply needed to change the rules of engagement in ways that put defenders at a persistent disadvantage. The Spencer Mansion, in its final hours before destruction, was filled with these creatures. The long corridors echoed with their breathing. The darker rooms might conceal them, lying prone and waiting for prey to approach. The areas where STARS members had fought and killed zombies days or even hours earlier had transformed into hunting grounds for these faster, deadlier variants. The mansion had become a living nightmare in the most literal sense, a structure animated by viral horror. When the mansion exploded, when the fireball consumed the building and sent debris raining across the forest, it marked the end of the Crimson Heads as an immediate threat. But it could not erase what they had revealed, that the T-virus had capabilities beyond what even its creators fully understood, that the path from human to zombie, to Crimson Head, to liquor, represented a continuum of horror with no clear endpoint, and that in a world touched by Umbrella's research, death itself had become just another stage in an endless cycle of transformation. The quiet breathing beneath the mansion, the sound that had heralded the presence of Crimson Heads to those unfortunate enough to hear it, fell silent. But the memory of that sound and what it represented would persist in the minds of survivors and in the classified reports of organizations now aware that biological weapons could self-improve, could resurrect and evolve without human intervention. making every outbreak potentially catastrophic in ways that previous warfare had never imagined. The true nature of the Crimson Heads, then, is not simply that they are faster zombies or more dangerous mutations. It's that they represent a fundamental break in how humans understand mortality and threat. They are the proof that in a universe infected by Umbrella's ambition, nothing stays dead unless extraordinary measures are taken. They are the nightmare that doesn't end when you close your eyes, but instead waits for you to open them again, crimson-skinned and breathing in the darkness, ready to teach you that survival is never guaranteed and safety is always temporary.